War does not forgive exposure, it does not reward consistency, and it rarely spares those who remain longest in its reach. On the Eastern Front of the Second World War, survival was usually measured in weeks, sometimes days. A frontline infantryman could expect frostbite before bullets, exhaustion before rest, and death without warning. Shells fell blindly, snipers waited patiently, artillery erased entire positions without ever seeing its victims. To endure this environment for 600 days, nearly 2 years of continuous frontline service, without suffering a single wound defied every known statistic of the war. Yet one man did exactly that, not from the safety of headquarters, not behind a desk or radar screen, but in the mud, snow, and shattered villages where survival was never guaranteed from one sunrise to the next. His story begins not with heroism, but with inevitability, because when the war came, there was no place to hide from it. He was not extraordinary when he arrived at the front. He carried no reputation, no legend, no promise of greatness. He was one of millions mobilized by a system that consumed men faster than it could train them. His uniform was ill-fitting, his equipment worn by someone else before him, his rifle already marked by previous hands. Like the others, he learned quickly that doctrine meant little once the shooting started. Training taught rules. The front punished assumptions. On his first day under fire, the world narrowed to sound and instinct, the scream of incoming shells, the concussive force of explosions that seemed to punch the air from his lungs, the sudden understanding that survival depended less on courage than on awareness. Men around him were wounded before they understood what was happening. Some froze, some ran, some disappeared entirely. He did neither. He moved when movement was required. He stayed low when staying low mattered. He listened more than he spoke. These were not heroic traits, they were survival traits. The Eastern Front was not a single battlefield. It was a continuous wound stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Winters froze weapons solid. Summers turned trenches into breeding grounds for disease. Supply lines collapsed under constant pressure. Commanders issued orders that could not be fulfilled with the men or material available. In this environment, a soldier's life expectancy was brutally short. Entire units could be replaced multiple times within a single campaign. New arrivals learned names only after sharing danger, because learning them too soon often meant learning how to mourn. Yet as weeks turned into months, this soldier remained, not untouched by danger, but untouched by injury. Bullets passed where he had stood seconds earlier. Shrapnel tore through packs and helmets instead of flesh. Shell fragments buried themselves inches from his boots. Every near miss reinforced an unspoken truth. Luck alone could not explain this. As the war dragged on, patterns emerged. He developed habits that others dismissed as superstition. He avoided certain positions instinctively, even when ordered to occupy them, choosing instead to adjust placement by meters rather than yards. He listened to artillery not just for volume, but for rhythm, learning when a barrage was walking forward and when it was about to reverse. He slept lightly, waking seconds before incoming fire more than once. When asked why, he never offered explanation. There was no philosophy behind it, only attention. While others focused on fear, he focused on environment. The wind carried sound, the ground vibrated before shells landed. Silence often meant danger, not safety. Over time, this awareness became automatic, as natural as breathing. He did not think about survival, he practiced it unconsciously. 600 days on the front line meant witnessing more death than most civilians could imagine in a lifetime. He watched replacements arrive and vanish. He saw officers killed while issuing orders and medics shot while dragging wounded men to safety. He experienced retreats that felt like collapse and advances that felt indistinguishable from suicide. Through it all, he remained operational. No evacuation, no hospital stays, no bandages stained with his own blood. Other soldiers noticed. Some avoided him, uncomfortable with the implication that survival might be unevenly distributed. Others stayed close, believing proximity offered protection. He discouraged neither. In war, belief itself could be a weapon. As his reputation grew, so did the danger. Veterans were assigned to the most critical sectors. Those who survived longest were trusted most and exposed most. He was placed where lines were weakest, where counterattacks were expected, where artillery fire was most concentrated. Each reassignment should have ended the anomaly. It never did. Instead, his survival became a quiet contradiction to the logic of attrition warfare. He was not invincible, he was vulnerable every moment. But vulnerability did not equal casualty. The difference lay in perception, the ability to sense when a position had become untenable seconds before it was destroyed, when to move laterally instead of forward, when obedience would mean death and initiative might mean survival. By the time his service crossed the 1-year mark, the war had changed him physically and psychologically, even if it had not wounded him. He aged rapidly. His movements became economical, deliberate. He wasted no energy. He spoke rarely. When he did, others listened, not because of rank, but because experience carried its own authority. 600 days without injury did not make him fearless. It made him precise. Fear was information, panic was noise. He learned to separate the two. This was not a story of destiny or divine protection. It was a story of adaptation under pressure so constant that it reshaped instinct itself. 600 days on the front line without a wound was not an accident repeated endlessly. It was the cumulative result of thousands of micro-decisions made correctly under stress: where to stand, when to move, when to hesitate, when to ignore orders that no longer matched reality. War punished mistakes instantly. It rewarded awareness slowly. And as the calendar continued to advance, one truth became impossible to ignore. This man was surviving a war designed to kill him. But survival had a cost, because every day lived was another day witnessed, another body counted, another position abandoned, another night spent listening for footsteps that might not be friendly. And as the war entered its most violent phase, the question was no longer how he had survived so long, but whether survival itself would become the most dangerous burden of all. By the time his service crossed the 200-day mark, survival was no longer remarkable. It was unsettling. On the Eastern Front, men did not last that long by chance alone. Units rotated through hell faster than paperwork could follow them, and the front itself shifted so violently that maps were often outdated before they were issued. Yet his name remained on the rolls, unaltered except for a growing list of campaigns fought and positions held. To commanders, this was both asset and anomaly. Veterans were invaluable. Veterans who never required evacuation were rare. Veterans who remained uninjured while others fell around them invited questions no one quite knew how to ask. Suspicion in wartime did not require evidence, it required deviation, and he deviated from expectation by continuing to exist. Officers noticed that he returned from engagements others did not, that he emerged from barrages with his equipment damaged but his body intact, that he was always present when positions were overrun yet somehow absent from casualty lists. Rumors began quietly, spreading through trenches and dugouts rather than official channels. Some whispered that he had a guardian. Others claimed he avoided danger deliberately, that he knew when to disappear. A few suggested something darker, that luck so consistent had to be paid for somehow. None of it mattered. War had no room for superstition, but it had no patience for questions either. Commanders began to test him, though they would never have described it that way. He was assigned to forward positions that rarely held. He was placed with units that were expected to absorb pressure rather than deliver victory. These were not promotions, they were trials. If he survived, the position was validated. If he did not, the anomaly was resolved. He survived, again and again. Each time his presence became associated not with safety but with endurance. Units that held longer than predicted often had him among their ranks. Positions thought untenable sometimes resisted collapse just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. This was not because he inspired others with speeches or bravado. He did not lead charges. He did not volunteer for heroics. His influence was quieter. He identified firing angles others missed. He noticed when an enemy advance slowed, when artillery fire shifted range, when silence replaced chaos. He shared this information sparingly, only when it mattered, only when it could be acted upon. The psychological toll of this kind of survival was cumulative. While wounds granted reprieve, a ticket away from the front, even temporarily, the uninjured remained. Each day without injury was another day earned, but also another day owed. He watched men leave on stretchers and felt no envy. He felt weight, because the longer he survived, the more responsibility he carried for remembering those who did not. He could recount names, positions, final moments with clarity that bordered on cruelty. Memory became a second battlefield, one with no rotation schedule and no relief. As months passed, the war entered phases of extreme intensity. Major offensives ground forward at unimaginable cost. Entire divisions were consumed to gain kilometers of frozen ground or ruined towns whose names meant nothing before the war and less after. During these operations, his survival bordered on statistical impossibility. Artillery preparation lasted days. Air attacks pulverized assembly areas. Infantry advanced through fire so dense it seemed continuous rather than intermittent. Men were wounded before stepping out of cover, and yet he moved through this chaos untouched. not unharmed because no one passed through unscathed but unbroken in flesh. The line between skill and chance blurred until it no longer mattered. The result was the same. Others began to change their behavior around him. They mirrored his movements, adopted his habits, followed his pauses. When he stopped, they stopped. When he shifted position, they followed. This was not superstition, it was observation. In a world where survival offered the only proof of correctness, his continued existence became evidence enough. He never claimed authority, he never contradicted orders openly. But in moments when orders collided with reality, men looked to him instinctively. And often he nodded once or shook his head. That was enough. The war, however, does not tolerate patterns for long. Adaptation invites escalation. Enemy forces refined their tactics, barrages intensified, defensive lines thickened. The environment grew deadlier by design. As pressure increased, his margin for error narrowed. Awareness had to become faster. Decisions had to be made with less information. The luxury of hesitation vanished. Survival was no longer about avoiding danger. It was about moving through it faster than it could close. By the time his service approached 400 days, the anomaly had become undeniable. Medical officers noted the absence of records. Personnel clerks double-checked files. Commanders stopped questioning and began relying. He was not promoted dramatically. He was not removed for study. War did not pause to analyze its own contradictions. Instead, it used them. He was placed where collapse was unacceptable, where delay could mean disaster. Where survival required not just endurance, but precision under fire. And still, no wound came. But the war was not finished with him yet, because as the front lines began to shift decisively and the enemy grew more desperate, the most dangerous phase was still ahead, not the phase of attack, but the phase of pursuit. And pursuit, history would show, killed as efficiently as defense. Say next when you're ready for segment 3, where the war accelerates, casualties spike, and survival begins to feel less like fortune and more like isolation. As the war passed the midpoint of his service, survival stopped feeling like success and began to feel like separation. The men who had arrived with him were gone, some wounded, some killed, some transferred to rear units after injuries that never fully healed. Replacement soldiers cycled through with alarming speed, young faces carrying expressions that still belonged to civilian life. He recognized that look immediately, the one that vanished after the first bombardment. He did not introduce himself anymore. Names were temporary, presence was not. The front line itself had changed. Where once there had been frantic defense and desperate holding actions, there was now momentum. The enemy retreated unevenly, leaving behind destroyed equipment, mined ground, and traps designed to kill those who survived the fighting. Advancement was no less lethal than defense. In some ways it was worse. Forward movement meant uncertainty. Every village was a potential ambush. Every abandoned position might be rigged to explode. The war punished curiosity and routine equally. This phase of the conflict demanded a different kind of awareness. Artillery was no longer constant but precise. Enemy fire came suddenly, accurately, often from positions that revealed themselves only once. Survival depended on recognizing patterns before they formed, noticing which buildings were too intact, which roads were too clear, which silence lasted too long. He developed an instinctive mistrust of anything that appeared untouched by war. Safety, he learned, was rarely obvious. Others continued to follow his lead, but the dynamic shifted. He was no longer just experienced, he was singular. New soldiers treated him with a mixture of respect and unease. 600 days without a wound was not inspirational to everyone. To some it felt accusatory, as if his survival highlighted their own vulnerability. He understood this instinctively and withdrew further, limiting interaction to necessity. He was careful not to be seen as favored by fate. In war, envy could be as dangerous as enemy fire. Sleep became irregular, not from fear but from anticipation. His body woke before danger arrived, a reflex sharpened by repetition. He found himself alert during lulls, uneasy during calm. Peaceful moments felt artificial, like pauses before something inevitable. The mind adapts to threat by expecting it, and his had adapted too well. He was most comfortable when moving, when engaged, when reacting. Stillness brought memories, movement brought purpose. Commanders now placed him with patrols and advance elements, units tasked with probing enemy positions and triggering responses. These missions carried high risk and little recognition. Patrols went out knowing that discovery meant engagement without support. He approached these tasks methodically. He read terrain like language, interpreting slopes, tree lines, and shadows. He noticed when birds fled suddenly, when wind carried unfamiliar sounds, when snow or mud showed patterns that did not belong. More than once, he halted a patrol seconds before disaster. No explanation followed. There was no time for it. The emotional cost of this awareness accumulated quietly. He felt responsible for outcomes beyond his control. When others were wounded despite correct decisions, he replayed moments endlessly, searching for missed signals. Survival did not bring relief, it brought accountability. The longer he remained, the more he felt he owed something, not to command, not to ideology, but to the men beside him who did not have his instincts or his luck. He began to act as a buffer between danger and inexperience, placing himself where risk was greatest, not from bravery but from calculation. If someone had to be exposed, better it be him. His record suggested he might endure it. As the war ground forward, casualty rates surged again. Final offensives were brutal, compressed in time and intensity. Enemy resistance hardened even as resources dwindled. Artillery fire intensified. Close combat became more frequent. Urban fighting erased distance entirely. These were conditions under which survival records were reset brutally. And yet he remained untouched. His uniform bore scars. His equipment was replaced repeatedly. His body carried fatigue beyond measurement. But no wound marked him. The paradox of his existence became complete. He was both most exposed and least injured. Those around him began to believe his presence altered outcomes, not by preventing danger but by navigating it. He never encouraged this belief. He feared it because belief could lead others to take risks they should not. He reminded them quietly that he was not protected, only attentive. As his service approached 600 days, the war began to close in on its final act. Victory was visible on maps and in communiques, but on the ground it felt no less deadly. In fact, it felt worse. Desperation sharpened everything. And in this final stretch, when exhaustion eroded caution and overconfidence crept in, survival would demand more than instinct. It would demand restraint. Because the most dangerous moment of all was approaching, the moment when the war appeared to be ending, but was not yet over. The final phase of the war did not announce itself with clarity. There was no clean transition from survival to safety, no unmistakable signal that the worst had passed. Instead, danger intensified even as victory seemed closer. Commanders pushed harder, timelines compressed, units advanced faster than intelligence could keep pace. The enemy, increasingly fragmented, fought with a kind of reckless determination that ignored long-term survival. These were the days when wars killed carelessly, not because objectives were vital, but because momentum demanded speed. For a soldier who had survived nearly 600 days without injury, this period posed the greatest threat. Fatigue dulled instinct, familiarity bred assumption. Men who had endured years of fighting began to believe the war owed them survival. He did not share that belief. If anything, he felt the opposite. The longer he lived, the more exposed he felt, as though probability itself was waiting for balance to be restored. Orders now emphasized pursuit. Enemy units were to be pressed relentlessly, denied rest, denied reorganization. This meant advancing into territory that had not been properly reconnoitered, crossing ground layered with mines, booby traps, and delayed action explosives. The war shifted from visible violence to invisible danger. A door handle could kill. A discarded helmet could hide a grenade. Roads were death traps disguised as convenience. He adjusted his behavior accordingly. Speed, he understood, was now the enemy of survival. He slowed deliberately even when pressure came from above. He insisted on checks others skipped. He distrusted urgency. More than once, this restraint saved lives, halting movement seconds before a mine detonated under the man ahead, stopping a rush into a building rigged to collapse, choosing a longer route that avoided a perfectly clear road. These decisions frustrated commanders eager for results, but results followed anyway. Units that advanced intact mattered more than kilometers gained quickly. The mental strain reached its peak. He was exhausted beyond rest. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between movements. His body operated on routine, his mind on vigilance. There was no release valve. Fear had transformed into something colder, an acceptance that danger was constant and final. He did not hope for safety, he worked to maintain it. Others now deferred to him openly, not as a leader in rank but as a guide in chaos. When he hesitated, they waited. When he redirected, they followed. This dynamic placed enormous pressure on him. A wrong call now would not only end his survival record, it could end many others. He felt this weight acutely. Survival was no longer personal, it was collective. The irony was cruel. After 600 days without injury, the closest calls now came not from enemy fire, but from mistakes, friendly artillery miscalculations, rushed planning, exhaustion-driven errors. War in its final act turned inward. He narrowly avoided death more times in this period than in any previous phase. A shell landed where he had stood moments before. A machine gun burst stitched the wall inches from his head. A booby trap detonated just beyond lethal range. Each incident reinforced the same lesson. The war was not finished, and it recentered the assumption that it was. As rumors of surrender began to circulate, danger increased rather than diminished. Men relaxed prematurely. Weapons were handled carelessly. Patrol discipline weakened. He fought against this instinct constantly, reminding those around him that wars killed most efficiently when people stopped paying attention. His vigilance bordered on obsession, but it worked. The anomaly endured. When the fighting finally slowed, when orders shifted from advance to hold, when the guns fell silent not just temporarily but completely, the realization came gradually. He was still alive, still uninjured. 600 days had passed without a single wound, not because the war spared him, but because he never assumed it would. The end did not bring celebration. It brought release so sudden it was disorienting. Without constant threat, his instincts had nowhere to go. The habits that had kept him alive now had no purpose. Silence felt wrong. Safety felt undeserved. Because survival, he understood, was not a victory condition. It was a consequence. When the war ended, the world rushed forward. Cities celebrated, governments reorganized, armies demobilized with administrative efficiency that felt almost cruel after years of chaos. For those who had survived the front, especially those who had done so without injury, the transition was abrupt. One day demanded constant vigilance, the next demanded nothing at all. For him, this shift was not relief, it was dislocation. Medical officers examined him with professional curiosity. 600 days on the front line without a wound demanded verification. Records were reviewed, unit logs confirmed continuous service, engagement reports listed his presence repeatedly. The conclusion was unavoidable, the anomaly was real, yet no explanation followed. There was no medical category for survival, no commendation for absence of injury. The war measured sacrifice in wounds and graft, not in endurance. Others reacted differently. Some treated him with quiet admiration. Others avoided discussion entirely, uncomfortable with a record that defied their own experience of loss. He understood both responses. Survival was a mirror no one asked to look into. It raised questions without answers. Why him, why not the others? There was no satisfactory response. He offered none. Physically, he appeared intact. Psychologically, he was saturated. The habits that had kept him alive now intruded into civilian life. He scanned rooms automatically. He flinched at sudden noises. He chose seats with sightlines. Restlessness followed him everywhere. The war had taught him that awareness equaled survival, and his body refused to unlearn that equation. 600 days of conditioning could not be undone by peace. He struggled most with idleness. In war, purpose was immediate. Decisions mattered instantly. In peace, time stretched without consequence. He missed the clarity, not the danger. He missed knowing what mattered next. Survival, stripped of context, felt hollow. He had outlived the war, but the war had not left him. The record followed him quietly, not as fame, but as rumor. People repeated the number 600 days with disbelief. Some treated it as luck, others as skill. He recognized elements of both, but also something else: refusal to assume safety, refusal to rush, refusal to let routine replace awareness. These were not heroic traits. They were habits forged under threat and maintained through discipline. In later years, military analysts would study casualty patterns, frontline rotation schedules, survival probabilities. His record appeared in footnotes, an outlier that resisted explanation. No formula could account for it fully. Statistics bent but did not break. The war remained lethal. He remained alive. What his story ultimately revealed was not invincibility, but the narrow margin between life and death. How often survival hinged on seconds, meters, decisions too small to be recorded. 600 days was not one continuous miracle. It was 600 individual days survived correctly. When asked how he did it, he answered simply, if at all. He paid attention. He did not believe the war would spare him. He behaved as if it would not. That assumption shaped everything. In the end, his survival did not diminish the sacrifices of others. It illuminated them. It showed how unforgiving the environment was, and how rare uninterrupted survival truly was. He carried no visible scars, but the weight of memory was permanent. Because surviving a war without injury does not mean escaping it. It means carrying it intact for the rest of your life. History remembers wars through numbers, divisions destroyed, territories gained, casualties counted. Individual survival rarely alters those tallies, yet occasionally a single record forces reconsideration of what war actually measures. 600 days on the front line without a wound does not change the outcome of a campaign. It changes how survival itself is understood. In retrospect, his endurance was not evidence of invulnerability, but of discipline sustained under extreme pressure. The Eastern Front was not defeated by heroes immune to harm. It was endured by men who learned, adapted, and remained alert long after exhaustion should have made that impossible. His story stands as a reminder that survival is not passive. It is an active process, repeated endlessly without guarantees. Military doctrine after the war would increasingly emphasize rotation, rest, and psychological resilience, lessons paid for by those who survived too long without relief. His experience illustrated what happened when endurance outpaced support. The body might remain intact, but the cost accumulated elsewhere. War could be survived physically and still be carried mentally forever. He did not seek recognition, and none truly fit. Medals commemorated actions, not absences. Survival left no citation, yet his record endured quietly passed between soldiers, historians, and analysts as an extreme case, not to be replicated but to be respected. It represented the outer limit of what attention, restraint, and adaptability could achieve in an environment designed to destroy them. In the end, the significance of his 600 days was not that he avoided injury. It was that he proved survival was shaped moment by moment, decision by decision. That war punished assumptions and rewarded awareness. That luck favored those prepared to notice danger before it announced itself. His story does not promise safety, it offers understanding. And in war, understanding is the rarest form of protection.